Hi everyone. We're now jumping into learning about the digestive system. So this is the basics and we'll learn more about the details later. So the overall learning intention is the digestive system is there to break our food down into smaller molecules that can then be absorbed and used for energy and nutrients. And you should be able to explain the overall functions of the digestive system, identify and label all the major organs, and explain the function of all those organs. So let's start with food. All animals have to eat food. Obviously, it's a huge part of our culture as humans. Nationalities and cultures have different foods. It's such a huge part of our everyday life, and that's because it's so fundamental to being an animal. So, plants obviously can use energy from the sun to make their food. They also use nutrients from the soil and the air. But for us as animals, we have to get all our energy and our nutrients all from eating foods. So to define food, essentially foods have to be an organic substance of some sort, and it has to be able to be broken down and absorbed by the animal, so you can get the energy and the nutrients out. So our digestive system is there to do that job. And the digestive system evolved over millions of years, and every species has a slightly different digestive system that's adapted to its food source. And they're the classic three types of eating that we've learnt before. So we have carnivores, herbivores, and omnivores, and they all have really specific adaptations to their digestive system. So we've got a little quokka down here, which are, it's a quoll that are carnivores, insects, and big herbivores like kangaroos. And then we've got birds, possums, and obviously us as omnivores that eat a combination of meat and plants. So what's digestion overall? Well, digestion has these 4 steps in it. And essentially, remember, we're getting our food and we're breaking it apart to get the energy and the nutrients out. So the first step of digestion is to just take the food in, which is called ingestion. Next is a process called mechanical digestion, which is also called physical digestion, and that's just physically breaking the food apart into smaller pieces. The next part of digestion is chemical digestion, which uses specific chemicals called enzymes to break food down into smaller molecules. So here's physical digestion. We've just chopped up our sandwich into smaller parts. And chewing is one of the examples of mechanical digestion. For chemical digestion, here we've got just a generic molecule here. It might be something like a protein. Some protein we've eaten, maybe we've eaten a nice steak and it's full of protein molecules. And then enzymes come along, which themselves are special proteins. And the enzyme comes along and it breaks apart that molecule into even smaller molecules. And for a protein, those would be amino acids, which are the building blocks of the protein. And then the 4th stage of digestion is elimination, which means you need to get rid of all the waste food that you don't need, which is go to the toilet. So the overview of a digestive system is essentially this one long tube, and it's called the gastrointestinal tract, or the GI tract for short. Another name is the alimentary canal. So all animals have this GI tract, well, most animals, and it's a one-way tube that food passes through. So the food goes in your mouth, it goes through the GI tract, and it comes out the end. So this diagram is just a long stretched out version of what our digestive system would look like if we took it all out into one long tube and pulled it out. There are also some accessory organs, which we'll learn more about, things like the liver and the pancreas. So the food doesn't pass through them, but they still are involved in digestion. So obviously our digestive system doesn't look like this. It's neatly packaged and everything's arranged in a specific way when it's actually in our body. Let's have a look briefly at the evolution of digestive systems, because it's always helpful to think, okay, when did these things actually evolve back in time? So if we're looking at the one-way digestive system like we have, they first evolved back in the more complex worms, things like nematodes. And examples of nematodes are roundworms, which you can see here in this microscope image. They're often actually parasites of your pets. You often have to give your dogs and cats roundworm treatment if they get infected by those. So here's the worms that we're talking about here on the evolutionary tree. So that means you can see all the species that evolved before them, like the sponges, the jellyfish, and the simple worms. They don't have a digestive system that's a one-way system, which is really efficient. So before that, they had this little digestive cavity. So looking at this jellyfish here, because that's one of the primitive species that has a digestive cavity, the food goes in, it gets digested and absorbed, and then it has to come out again from the same hole. So in those primitive species, their mouth is the same hole as their anus. Okay, here's our digestive system. So these are all the main organs we'll learn about. We'll jump in and we'll have a look at the function of each of these. You've probably heard of most of them. So let's get into it. Starting with the mouth and the salivary glands. So the mouth is sort of a generic organ. It's actually made up of lots of smaller organs like the teeth, the tongue, the taste buds on your tongue, the salivary glands at the back of your mouth, and then the throat and the epiglottis. So the function of the mouth is pretty obvious. It's the teeth and your tongue that start to break your food apart when you chew it, and so that's the first time we have mechanical digestion happening. And then there's also lots of enzymes in our saliva. Enzymes are just a type of protein which speeds up chemical reactions. So the enzymes in your saliva, they get produced by your salivary glands and they begin the chemical digestion of your food too. Particularly carbohydrates. Like you'll notice if you eat chips or bread, it starts to dissolve in your mouth because of those enzymes breaking it apart. There's also the epiglottis at the back of your throat, which is that little trapdoor which it flips open when you're breathing normally. Here's someone's epiglottis at the back of their throat. And when you swallow, the epiglottis flips down. So it's upright normally. And then when you swallow, it flips down to block the airway and allowing the food to go down into your esophagus. Here's some food after it's gone through the mouth and it's starting to be digested. Okay, the esophagus is next. Essentially, it's the food tube, carries your food down into the stomach. So the esophagus is a really tube-like organ. It's about 25 centimeters long in most people. It's surrounded by muscular walls, so it can move. And there are lots of glands in the walls that secrete mucus. So the main function of the esophagus is to push the food down into your stomach. And it does that with this process called peristalsis. So here's peristalsis happening. Once you swallow, your food gets rolled up into a little ball called a food bolus. And there's lots of mucus lining the walls of the esophagus, so the mucus helps it to move smoothly. And then essentially the muscles of the esophagus squeeze the food down, pushing from behind it, and then the muscles relax ahead of it, allowing the food to be pushed down. If you picture yourself squeezing toothpaste out of a toothpaste tube when it's getting near the end, that's pretty much the same process as peristalsis. Here's a little food bolus going down the esophagus. Okay, we've now reached the stomach and we're ready to start some more digestion. So, the structure of the stomach, it's quite folded up. You can see all these ridges here in the inside wall. And it's also surrounded by layers and layers of muscle. You can see here there's at least 4 different layers of muscle. And there's also lots of glands on the inside that secrete various chemicals. So the reason it's folded up is because it can expand heaps into a much bigger organ when it's filled with food. You can kind of imagine it being like a piano accordion that can expand and contract. So the function of the stomach Firstly, it continues that mechanical digestion by churning your food. So your muscles of your stomach are constantly pushing and squishing your food together. That's why it's much better for your digestion if you're active and you're walking around. It helps that churning process. It also continues the chemical digestion because there are plenty more enzymes that get secreted by those glands in the stomach, and they make part of the gastric juice, and those enzymes are breaking down the large food molecules. Once the food reaches the stomach and it gets digested at this stage, we call it chyme. And here's a great picture of some chyme in someone's stomach during an endoscopy. Okay, we're now through the stomach. We've reached the end of the stomach, and we're going to look at a couple of accessory organs. So this one's called the pancreas. Remember, accessory organs, the food doesn't actually pass through them. So here is the basic structure of the pancreas. It's a pretty small organ, and its structure is essentially it's solid, and it's full of many cells that secrete enzymes. And thinking back to the last topic, they're going to secrete all those enzymes using exocytosis because they're proteins that got made by the cell and they need to get them out of the cell. The function of the pancreas? Well, all those enzymes are digestive enzymes. So they get pumped into the small intestine. You can see this tube, this small little tube running through the pancreas. That's a duct that collects all the digestive enzymes and it sends it into the start of the small intestine up here. We've got two more accessory organs, and they're the liver and the gallbladder. So the liver is the large dark brown organ. It actually has a few other functions in different systems as well. And the gallbladder is this small little one here. It's actually not that green in real life. So both of them are accessory organs. The food doesn't go through them. The liver is similar to the pancreas. It's just a solid mass of tissues, and lots of those tissues are glands that release chemicals. And the gallbladder is a small little storage sac. So the liver, its main function is to produce bile. And then it transfers that bile to the gallbladder, and the gallbladder stores it. And then once the bile is ready to be sent into the small intestine, it passes through a small tube, which you can see, the little green tube on the end here. And that passes into the top of the small intestine again, and that tube's called the bile duct. So the whole job that bile does is it's mainly got these salts in it called bile salts, and their job is to emulsify fats that are in your food. Here's a close-up view. We've got the bile duct here. So the bile emulsifies fats, which means it basically mixes them together and makes them more soluble in water. And that means it's easier for those digestive enzymes to get in there and break the fats apart. Emulsifiers are commonly used in foods as well. So here's some salad dressing. If you don't add an emulsifier, it separates into the water and the oil-based compounds. The oil sits on the top. But if you add an emulsifier, it makes those oils soluble and it mixes everything together. And that's how you get these creamy salad dressings. Okay, we've passed through the stomach. We've gone past the liver and the gallbladder and the pancreas, and now we're into the small intestine. So the small intestine is just one long thin tube, and the average length is 7 meters in an average person. So obviously it has to wrap and be neatly arranged in the body to reduce space. And you might have seen in surgeries, if you've ever seen any documentaries, surgeons can take out the intestines during surgery and they basically just stuff them back in again. And the small intestine is arranged with its connective tissue that it will naturally go back and neatly fold up into its normal shape, even after surgery like that. If you go and look at a zoomed in version, you can see the small intestine has lots of folds in it, and that's to increase surface area. So again, we're back to that surface area to volume ratio concept. More surface area is going to help with whatever process we're looking at. And that's going to help with absorption because that's the key process that the small intestine does. The small intestine is also a neutral pH. I didn't mention it earlier, but the stomach is very acidic, and that helps it for the specific enzymes that are in there. The stomach is around pH 2 to 3, so really acidic. So when we're in the small intestine, its main job, like I said, is to absorb all those molecules and nutrients and water that's come from our food, which means bringing it out of the interior space and into our bloodstream. It does that through all the processes we've learnt so far. So the cells on the lining of the intestine, they use passive transport to bring in nutrients, and they use active transport to bring in nutrients. Things like endocytosis or protein pumps. And so it's these long villi here that are giving the small intestine lots of surface area. And if you zoom in again, each of those individual cells has lots of folds in it, so there's a huge surface area on the inside. Here's some food once it's finished being digested in the small intestine. Alright, so the final organ is the large intestine. Again, it's just a long tube. It's wider than the small intestine, that's where it gets its name. It's about 1.5 meters long. It also has smoother walls than the small intestine, they're not folded. And it has lots of mucus secreting cells on the inside. It also includes the rectum and the anus. So the rectum is the last section here, and the anus is the muscle ring at the end. So the function of the large intestine is reabsorption, something we don't often consider. But when we eat food and we drink water, there's so much extra water and ions dissolved in there that it's still useful to collect that and not lose it as waste. So all of that gets absorbed and gets sent back into the bloodstream so we can reuse the water and the ions. Now there's nothing left that needs to be kept. So whatever's left is a little bit more solid. It's not that liquid chyme anymore. So that whatever's left passes to the rectum, and that's where our feces get stored until we go to the toilet. And the anus is just a ring of muscles which removes the feces from our body. And the scientific name for a ring of muscles that we can control is a sphincter. Alright, we really don't need a picture of the feces that comes out. So we've reached the end of our journey in digestion. Here's the learning intentions again, and I'll see you in class.